Hilchos Tumas Meis Perek Shloisha Asar, the laws of corpse impurity, chapter 13. Today we continue with the rules that we learned yesterday about oihel. Oihel means tent, and it refers to the power of a corpse to transmit its impurity to anything that's in the same tent as it. As we learned yesterday though, tent doesn't mean structure or building or room. Tent could refer to any halachically significant covering. What are the basic criteria for that? That the covering has to have a dimension of tefach by a tefach, 1 handbreadth by 1 handbreadth, and there has to be a height of a tefach of airspace between the covering and the source of impurity or the ground. Once you've created what's called a halachically significant oihel, the oihel has a double power, and we must remember these terms. Mevi es hatuma, it spreads the tuma to everything under it. Chaytzetz bifnei hatuma, it blocks the tuma from leaving it or from entering it. So like in this scenario, if you have a corpse flesh and some needles under the covering and some pots over the covering, since the covering meets the criteria, it spreads the tumah from the corpse to the needles under it, but it blocks the tumah from the pots that are above it. The Rambam today is going to tell us 2 things. First of all, in order for this oihel to happen, it needs to be a strong, sturdy covering, not a weak one. Once it's a weak one, and we'll define what makes strong and what makes weak, then it goes into a different category. And that leads the Rambam to going into actually listing all the different types of coverings. The coverings that have both powers of spreading tumah and blocking tumah, the covers that only have the power of spreading tumah but don't have the power of blocking, the covers that have the power of blocking but don't have the power of spreading, and the covers that have neither power, not mevi and not chaytzitz. That's where we're heading in today's chapter. Says the Rambam halacha aleph, he summarizes what we learned yesterday. Kol tefach al tefach berum tefach. Anytime you have a covering, which is the dimensions of 1 tefach by 1 tefach in length and width, and there's a height of a tefach of airspace between it and the source of impurity or the ground, that's called an oihel. When Torah says tent, this is also included, as we explained, and it has the immediate double power of a tent. The chaytzetz bifnei hatuma, it blocks the tumah from leaving it, umevi es hatuma, and it spreads the tumah to everything under it. First of all, says the Rambam, this applies bein sha'asa'ahu leha'ahil, bein shanasa me'ilav. Whether this covering was made with the intention of serving as a cover, or it was made by itself, by circumstance. Afilu haya shaloi bidei adam. Even if it wasn't by human intervention, a covering just came about. Hareza mevi v'chaytzetz. If it meets the criteria of being a tefach by a tefach, with a height of an airspace of a tefach, it becomes an oihel, spreading tumah and blocking tumah from above it. Ketzad, what's an example of coverings that came about on their own? Echad choyer shecharoruhu mayim. Whether this means it's a hole that was dug out by water. Sometimes you see these rock formations or these elements of earth near the sea, and with enough tide or enough water washing over it, it creates this little hole. And now, out of the hole emerges a covering. If that covering is a tefach by a tefach and there's a tefach of airspace, anything under it, if there's corpse and anything else, it will spread, and anything above it will not be affected. Or you have a hole that was dug out, burrowed by some rodents. You have a chipmunk or a weasel digs out these holes sometimes. Not always are they straight in. Sometimes they go in sideways, and now you end up with a covering that's a tefach by a tefach, and there's some room under it. If a corpse and something else would be under it, that would classify and the tumah would spread. Anything above it would be blocked. Or you have an area in the ground which was eaten up by malachas. Malachas, there's 2 interpretations as to what this means. Either it means the soil dried up so much that it created a crack in the earth. Here you have a sinkhole, just to bring out the idea, the earth cracks apart, and now you're left with a hole with a covering. Notice there's a covering over there. If the covering is a tefach by a tefach, again I repeat, just to bring out the point, and there's a corpse and other things under it, it will spread. Anything above it will be blocked. Another interpretation of malachas is actually from the expression lachut, moisture. If the ground got too moist and that caused some hole-like entity to be formed inside the ground, same thing. If it meets the criteria, it's mevi v'chaytzitz. Or a person makes a pile of stones or a pile of wooden beams, v'nasa b'hen chalal tefach, and within the pile, sometimes there could be leftover airspace, and there's an airspace of a tefach. In all these cases, this covering which has been created, even if it wasn't created with the intent of covering, it just happened to be out of circumstance, it's classified as a halachic oil, umevi v'chaytzitz, with the full power to spread tumah under it and to block tumah from entering it. Halacha Beis, here comes the big caveat. When do we say this? If the covering, in this case these formations or stuff that have been formed out of circumstance, were strong and sturdy and healthy. That's when they can be a spreader and a blocker. Aval oyhel ra'ua. But if it's a weak type of tent, and the Rambam will soon give examples of this, if it's a weak type of tent, biblically, it's as if it doesn't exist. It doesn't spread the tuma, it doesn't block the tuma. We just imagine as if it's not there. And then what's the law? Well, we always had it. Tuma baikas va'ila baikas v'yeredes. Whenever there's a piece of corpse, it just goes all the way up and all the way down. Anything which passes over it becomes impure. But the tent element, even though it's being covered by this weak tent, since it's weak, it's non-existent. It cannot spread, it cannot block. That's biblically. Aval midivrei seifrim, rabbinically, they converted it actually to the worst. They said, Mevias hatuma ve'einei chaytzitz. They allowed the tuma to spread, but they didn't allow it to be a blocker. Which now means, not only does everything under it become impure, but the whole covering becomes impure and therefore transmits impurity to everything that's above it. So kind of a huge transition from biblically not being recognized at all to rabbinically being a spreader, but not a blocker. Ketzad, what's a classic example of a weak covering? Sarigei ha'ilanes ha'seichechim al ha'aretz. You have thick branches coming out of a tree, and now they're creating shade over an area of the ground. It's very thick leaves. It becomes like a real covering. And it's got the dimensions, tefach by a tefach. These are called in halacha schachos, like schach of a sukkah, a covering. It means a covering formed by branches. Another example would be va'avanim hayotzes min hageder haseicheches al ha'aretz. You have stones protruding from a wall that are also covering the ground. These are called in halacha prois. The word pera means a growth. As by the Nazarite it says, gadel pera sa'ar roshei, pera. So in this case the wall is growing. There's some stones protruding out of it. These are weak protrusions. These are weak forms of coverings. So the Rambam first gives us the way to determine whether it's weak or not. If they could be covered with what's called ma'aziva. Ma'aziva is the layer of mud, tar, those kinds of materials that were put down on top of roof beams to strengthen them, like a coating. There were thick coatings, there were thin coatings, and there were beinanis, average coatings. So if it can be covered with a layer of average coating, and they will still stand, the weight will not bring them down, that's a sturdy tent. These, even if they're stone protrusions or even if they're leaves sticking out, but they might be very sturdy branches, and that's fine. They're a real oyel, they spread and they block, biblically. But if they're not strong enough to handle this layer of average coating, rather if you put this mud on them, they would actually fall down, cave into the weight. These are weak tents. And then, so biblically they're not recognized at all, but rabbinically they become a spreader, but not a blocker. And the same applies to all similar situations of weak tents. Halacha Gimel. Now that we've mentioned how some tents are spreaders and blockers, and some tents are spreaders but not blockers, let's get the full list of all the variations of different types of coverings in terms of how they can spread and block. Halacha Gimel Elu Meviin v'chaytzitzin. This is the list of things that is the highest level oyel. They spread tuma to everything under it, and they block tuma from leaving and entering it. Kli eitz haba b'mida. First of all, a wooden utensil which comes in oversize. Once a utensil comes in oversize, which is classified as being able to hold 40 sa'ah volume of liquid, it loses its status of being a utensil. So in this case, it's just considered to be a covering. And therefore, anything under it will become tameh, anything above it will be blocked. Same thing would apply if it's a stone utensil, if it's a dung utensil, if it's an earthen utensil. As long as they're oversized, they lose their status of a keli, and they become a full oyel, mevi v'chaytzetz. They spread tumah to everything under it, block tumah from everything above it. Additionally, upshute klei oir, plain, non-receptacle things made out of leather. Let's call it a leather mat. V'yiriya. Yiriya is a thick cloth mat. V'sadin, a linen sheet. Umapats, a woven mat made out of branches, tree branches or tree bark. Umachzeles, or a reed mat. All of these things, shehenasuyin oyalim, if they are formed into tent-like shapes. So they're now they're shaped like a covering, or maybe they're draped as a canopy. The point is they're being used in a covering thing. They're mevi v'chaytzetz. Anything under it will become impure, anything above it will be blocked. Ubeheimeis eichayes, also animals or beasts, bein tmeis, bein tahayis, whether they're kosher or non-kosher, if they're standing in a row. But the Rambam immediately clarifies, V'hu sheyiyeh roish zu bein raglei zu. The head of one animal has to be inserted between the back legs of the next animal, v'hayu kulan dvukai, so that they're all stuck to one another. If you have a row of animals, the head is inserted between the legs, and so on and so forth, so you have this chain. Now the area under all their stomachs becomes one big oyhel, and anything under it, if there's corpse and other things, it'll spread the tumah to everything under it. Anything above it will be blocked. A bird which is at rest. A bird is on a branch, its wings are stretched out, there's a corpse over here, corpse flesh, there's some utensils over here. The wings of the bird become an oyhel, mevi v'chaitzet, full on, spreads tumah to everything under it. If there was anything above it, the tumah would be blocked. The commentaries right here insert that obviously it has to meet the condition which the Rambam mentioned before, that the wings of the bird have to be sturdy enough that if it would be layered with a coating, it would be able to hold. Or others say it could be talking about a smaller bird if it's tied down. If it's tied down to the branch, we'll see in a moment that there's an example of other things. If they're tied down, they become a full oil. So if the bird was tied down, it can become an oil even if it cannot handle that weight. Another case, a person digs out in some grain stalks a little place for a child to save him from the sun, a little protection. But now what have you created? You've created a covering which has the proper dimensions. This is now mevi v'chaitzet. If there's a corpse there, it'll spread the tumah to everything under it. Anything above it will be blocked. Also, if you have food, if they're not susceptible yet to becoming tameh, so they shouldn't become impure. We're going to learn later in this book, there's a whole section of laws, that food can only become impure if it's detached from the ground and it's been in contact with one of these 7 halachic liquids. Water is the classic one. Until then, the food cannot become impure. So as we're going to learn in a moment, if something becomes impure, it cannot be a real oil. It cannot block the tum. So when the Rambam says you make a hole in a pile of food, it has to be food that's not mukhshar, that's not yet susceptible to becoming tameh, so they don't go into the category of things that can become impure. Then, if there's a hole and it meets the criteria, tefach by a tefach with a tefach of airspace, it'll spread tumah to everything under that covering and block the tumah from everything that's above it. Additionally, leafy vegetable plants that are perennial. They can live in the summertime and in the wintertime. They're like trees. And they are a full oil. They can spread tumah to everything under it, block tumah from everything above it. What are examples of this? The Rambam only picks 4 examples. Ve'eluhain they are. Ha'edus. Edus is a subject of debate what it is. Some say it's the iris plant, that's this one. The Rambam in his commentary to the Mishnah writes that it's nana, it's mint. Others interpret it to be the hedge mustard plant. Eidos, any of these plants, these are plants, if they form a covering and there's a corpse and other things under it, they'll spread the tumah to what's under and they'll block from what's over. The hakisus, or kisum, some Rambams have. Kisus is either ivy plant or it's this flower that's called field bindweed. Same thing, they have the power of mevi'in v'chaitzitsim. The yarkos chamor, vegetables that are eaten by donkeys, udlas yevanis, and the Greek gourd, the Greek squash, the calabash type of squash. These plants, again, they can create a proper covering, mevi v'chaitzitz. V'chein haschachais v'haprois. So too, the 2 things we mentioned before. The branches sticking out from a tree, and the walls that are protruding. Again, of course, assuming that they're strong and they can handle the weight. V'hazizin v'hagezurais, or some people have v'hagezuz teriyos, different types of ledges. We're going to be dealing with these ledges later at length, but basically, a ziz is a type of ledge that sticks out and has an edge pointing downwards. A gezura, or a gezuztera, is a ledge that has an edge pointing upwards. These ledges stick out of a wall. Things can be under them. They serve as a proper covering. If they're a tefach by a tefach and there's corpse and utensils under it, it will spread the tumah from the corpse to the utensils. Anything above it will be blocked. The hashayvachos. Shevachos are birdhouses. Either it refers to the actual birdhouse structure. In some texts of the Rambam's commentary, it seems like, to the Mishnah, it seems like he's referring to a ledge that sticks out of the birdhouse where the birds come out and they play and they stand there. So if that ledge is covering things, it's a proper oil, mevi v'chaitzitz. The hashkifin, shkifin are clefts of rock inside mountain. The hasloim are stone clefts in a stone wall, not in a bedrock. The hanechirim, or some texts have gichirim, is a leaning wall. You have a wall that's kind of bent over, and now it somewhat forms a covering. V'hashnanin, shnanin are rocky protrusions that are sticking out of bedrock. Kol elu mevin v'chaytzatzin, all of these things are full oils. If there's a size that's the proper size, tefach by a tefach of airspace, and there's a corpse and other things under it, they spread the tumah to everything under it, and they block the tumah from everything above it. Halacha dalid ve'elu mevin v'loy chaytzatzin. Then we have the list of things that are an oil enough in that they spread tumah to everything under them, but they're not strong enough to block. And therefore they actually become even worse in terms of impurity because they spread tumah to also things that are above them. Ha'adam, first of all, the human being, that we learned yesterday as well. A human being covers a corpse and utensils. He's oil enough to spread the tumah from the corpse to the utensils, but if there's something on top of him, he doesn't block. Uklei eitz she'enan bayin b'mida, wooden utensils that are not oversized. They're called kalim. As we saw yesterday, when it comes to kalim, since they have another use besides for being a covering, they don't become fully a covering, and therefore, while they're covering enough to spread the tumah, they're not enough to block the tumah. Yeah, because they're like all utensils which can become impure. Things that can become impure cannot serve as coverings. Those 5 things we mentioned before: the leather mats and the cloth mats and the sheet and the reed mats and the thick branch mats. All these things, if they're not made like in this picture, they're all made like an oil. What if they're not made like an oil? They're simply stretched out. Now, how do you have something which is simply stretched out without being a covering? Isn't that a canopy? A canopy is a covering. So the commentaries explain it's referring to this case. You have 2 floors in a home. The top floor has a hole in it. And so in order to cover the hole, you put a carpet of a mat or one of these types of cloths. And now if you're downstairs, the hole is being covered only by this mat covering. But the mat covering was not put down to be a covering. It was just put to be a sealer for the hole. There's no diagonal, there's no walls, it's just flat. This is not such a powerful oil. It can spread to whatever's under it, but it cannot block from above. If you have a dead animal or a dead beast, or food that could become susceptible to impurity or is already impure, it's because impure things cannot block. They can serve to be a spreader but not a blocker. And also a hand mill. It's included in stone utensils. Anything which is a utensil is a spreader but not a blocker. Kol elu mevin v'leichaitzitz, in all of these things, spread the tumah to what's under them but do not block what's above them. Halacha hey ve'elu lei mevin v'leichaitzitz. The following things are non-existent in terms of coverings. If they're on top of a corpse and other things, we just consider it as if it's not there. Doesn't block, doesn't spread, nothing. Hazroyim. Zroyim are plants that have a pod with an edible inside, like a pea. V'hayirakos, leafy vegetables, where the leaf itself is edible, like here's the cabbage plant, choose one example. Hamechubarim lakarka, while they're attached to the ground. If they stretch out their leaves and whatnot, they're not a covering, not for spreading, not for blocking. Chutz min ha'arba yirakos shemaninu, except for the 4 vegetables we mentioned before, the eidos and the kisus, and the donkey's vegetables, and the Greek gourd. The kipas habarad, a dome formed by hail. Imagine hail made a covering. The hashelek, or a dome formed by snow. The hakfar, or a dome formed by frost. The haglid, frozen ice, if they make a covering. The hamelach, and salt. The hadoileg mimakim lamakim, the hakaifetz mimakim lamakim, somebody skipping or jumping from place to place, even if during the jump he's covering something. The ha'oif hapareach, a bird which is in flight. Not like the last case, the bird was resting. This bird is in flight. V'talis haminaf nefes, a talis or a cloth which is waving in the wind and creates a covering. Usfina shehi shata al pnei hamayim, a boat that's going on the water while it's traveling, if it becomes an oil of sorts. Kol elo le'mevin v'leichaitzitz. All of these things, even if they happen to be covering a corpse and other things together, they're not a spreader, not a blocker. Sha'af pisha ha'ehilu, even though they are forming a covering, eino eila miskayim. None of these are lasting coverings. The bird is just flying, the talis is just blowing in the wind, the person is just jumping. Even the frost and the snow, they're all going to melt. So all these things, since they have no lasting property, so they're not an oil in any way, they don't spread, they don't block. Halacha vav, kashar es hasfina, bedavar shu yachal ha'amida. What if you would tie down the boat to something which could anchor it? Kavash knaf hatalis be'even, or the cloth that we were talking about before. If you put it as a weight, you put a rock over it, so now it's being held down, and then the wind comes and blows it up. Now these are real oils, and now it will spread the tumah, even if it doesn't block it, but it's powerful enough to be a spreader. Halacha zayin neser shehutzaf al pnei hamayim. You have a board and I made it a curved board, just to bring out the point. It's floating on the water. V'tuma tachas tzidoy ha'echad, and there is impurity under one side. Here's a piece of corpse flesh floating on the water under the one side of the board. Harei hakelim shetachas tzidoy hasheni tohedim. Any utensils under the other board, the other part of the board, are going to be pure, even though it seems to be an oyel. But this floating board is no better than a floating boat. We just explained that if you have a boat which is in the middle of floating, it doesn't spread the tuma. Neither does this board. The following things are actually the best. They're blockers, but they're not spreaders. Maseches prusa. You have a loom that's ready to go, ready for weaving. Without getting into too much detail, how does a loom work? On the basic level, there's two beams on the sides. The threads go across it. Those are the warp threads. And then you lift every other thread and you put the woof thread through, and then you keep going, you alternate. Pick these up, and then it goes this way, then you pick them up again, and it goes that way. Here we're talking about a loom that has all of the warp threads. It's called the shesi, across. That's why it's called maseches prusa, because it's all spread out, ready to go. You haven't begun to weave the woof threads through the other way, just the shesi is ready to go. And the point that we're about to make is, even though there's small pockets of airspace between the little strings, the whole frame of the strings becomes powerful enough to block tuma. V'chavile mita, same thing if it's ropes in a bed frame. The bed frame used to be tied with a net on the bottom to hold the mattress or to hold the person in a similar way to weaving. There would be warp threads going along the length and then threads going along or ropes going along the width. The Rambam over here, as the commentators explain, is referring to only the length threads are in the bed frame. V'hamashpela, baskets or boxes, wicker, they're woven. And they also have little pockets of air, but they more or less form a solid entity. And the screens that are in windows. Today we have these professional window screens that are literally woven down to the tiniest bit. But they used to have in the olden days as well some kind of a screen that you would put in these windows made out of branches in some places that Rambam writes in his commentary to the Mishnah. They would put branches this way, branches that way, and it kind of closed the window in some way or another. So the Rambam says these things have the power to block tuma without spreading it. What does that mean? How do they block? Let's consider the case where there's a window between two homes or two rooms. And there's a source of impurity in one of the rooms. So tomorrow we're going to have at length how tuma goes through windows. But typically if a window is a certain size, if it meets the criteria, it will allow the tuma to transfer from one room to the next. In this case, says the Rambam, one of these four things, the loom, the bed frame, the wicker basket, the screen, was stretched into the window frame and it's sealing it. Even though in each case you have little pockets of airspace between the threads, between the ropes, between the pieces of wicker and between the screen lines. Nevertheless, they now block the tuma, and they're not going to allow the tuma to come in to the second room. Who says the Rambam? That's provided provided that in these woven screens or in the eyes of the basket, in other words, those open little spaces, or between the ropes of the bed frame or the loom, that there should not be an opening the size of a tefach. Because if there was an opening the size of a tefach, the tuma will be able to enter it, as we'll be explaining at length in tomorrow's chapter.